Hi everyone! In the grim darkness of the 31st millennium, it can feel like there are as many Space Marine chapters as there are atoms in the galaxy, but there is one in particular that assured a whole new generation of Warhammer fans. And after 2 real-life decades and multimedia appearances, we still have more questions than answers about them, which is fitting given their own never-ending quest for knowledge. Let's talk about the Blood Ravens. The Blood Ravens are an unusual chapter, due to their whole existence being tied to a video game franchise. So we need to explore their real-life background first to better appreciate their in-universe lore. It is possible that if you didn't grow up with the video games of the early 2000s and, for example, just saw them in the Space Marine 2, you may have no idea who the Blood Ravens are. For a time though, it was the Blood Ravens, not the Ultramarines, that many hobbyists had as their first exposure to Space Marines and broader 40k. In 2002, a video game company called Relic Entertainment, already an established name in the booming real-time strategy market, began work on a new title in a Warhammer 40,000 setting. They called it Dawn of War, after a deployment type in tabletop 40k. Kinda clever if you ask me. Dawn of War needed a protagonist faction, which unsurprisingly turned out to be Space Marines. But as many of you know, the Astartes are split into countless chapters that determine everything from how they look to preferred methods of warfare. Relic then had 2 options. Either use a popular pre-existing chapter to help games marketing, or create one from scratch, giving them more flexibility. Today, choosing one of the most developed first founding chapters, such as Blood Angels or, of course, the Ultramarines, could be almost certain. Back then, however, Games Workshop was a bit less rigid about those things. In fact, Dawn of War 1 released merely a month after 40k's 4th edition and Battle for Macragge starter set, a time which, according to many, marked a beginning of Ultramarine dominance over the Space Marine line we still know today. Taking this opportunity, Relic came up with the Blood Ravens. At first, an extremely basic Space Marine chapter, easily color swapped into any other, which itself fit with the game's customization options. However, with new entries in the Dawn of War series, as well as their novelizations and continued collaboration with Games Workshop, they swiftly grew their own distinct history and culture, filled with mystery and a bit of heresy. Blood Ravens' recorded history begins in the 37th millennium, but there are mentions of their presence at least centuries before that. A product of unknown founding, their history is mostly unknown even to them, with inquisitorial authority blocking many records related to the chapter. Their gene heritage is also unknown, with them being an offshoot of Reboot Gilman's Ultramarines, the most likely of all the options. But that just mostly because it's an assumption for almost any chapter with no other obvious lineage. There is one other possibility besides Ultramarines we will need to talk about, but more on that later. The early history of the chapter is marked by one particularly important campaign in the Gothic sector, during which the Blood Ravens fought Chaos cults organized by the Alpha Legion. From the get-go, the Blood Ravens did terribly in this campaign, suffering heavy losses, including even their chapter master and the Master of Sanctity. 2 of the 3 most important ranks in the chapter gone merely at the campaign's opening battles. Not all was lost, however. Azariah Vidya, a chief librarian at the time, and now highest ranking member of the chapter, was an extraordinarily powerful psyker, and used divination powers as well as his great intellect to probe the heretic forces with Imperial Guard units and locate the heretic forces' weak spots. The tactic proved to be an immense success, with the main heretic threats wiped out within months of Vidya taking command. For his heroic deeds in the chapter's Darkest Hour, Azariah Vidya was chosen for a dual role of a chief librarian and a chapter master of the Blood Ravens. Dual roles for chapter officers are a rare but not unheard of practice. For example, in the Iron Hands chapter, a rank of Iron Father merges duties of both chaplain and tech marine, fitting the chapter's reverence of union between technology and flesh. But to combine two most powerful roles in the chapter into one is virtually unheard of. Furthermore, psychers, even ones in high offices, are often distrusted in the Imperium due to their connection to the corrupting powers of the warp. So to have a powerful psyker control a whole Astartes chapter was bound to raise some concerns. Nonetheless, at the time, Vidya was often referred to as the Great Father or the Father Librarian, highlighting how respected he must have been in the chapter by his brothers. If there were any objections to his leadership at the time, they didn't make it into chapter's records. In fact, Azariah became almost a substitute for the chapter's unknown Primarch. Divination and careful study of every enemy movement characteristic to Vidya became a fundamental chapter tactic from that point. This also set a precedent for the later chapter masters to also be chosen from the ranks of the librarians, instead of normal officers. Azariah Vidya is also attributed with creation of the Apocrypha of the Unfounding, a tome establishing Blood Ravens' dogma on their unknown history. In summary, Apocrypha of the Unfounding postulates that the history of the Blood Ravens had been deliberately obscured by the agents of the Golden Throne. The text then argues that by the Emperor's own design, it is only the Blood Ravens who should seek the truth about their origins, and no one else in the Imperium. It is unknown how focused on this search for the lost knowledge the Blood Ravens were before, but since Vidya took control of the chapter, it became the core of their identity. Crucial in this search was an extraordinary amount of librarians Blood Ravens possessed, many awakening their powers only after the gene seed implantation. Does this sound familiar? So as I've mentioned previously, officially no one knows to what Primarch Blood Ravens can trace their origins. But there are some hints it might be Magnus the Red, father to the Thousand Sons Legion and traitor to the Imperium. Both Thousand Sons and Blood Ravens have an unusual high number of psychers in their ranks, a gift that in both cases is amplified by their gene seed. The Corvide cult of the Thousand Sons in particular were also masters of the precognition and divination psychic disciplines, the same ones the chapter favors so much. Heresy era Thousand Sons colors also strike a remarkable resemblance to those of Blood Ravens. Although superficial, there were also some hints in literature covering the chapter, possibly including even the Horse Heresy, but none of them are clear or are very out of date as far as overall lore is concerned. This connection would fit well with the obfuscation of Blood Raven's history from the rest of the Imperium. Someone inappropriate learning that your chapter is linked to a traitor legion could turn out to be very problematic indeed. However, it all shouldn't be taken as anything more than a theory, especially with how eager 40k fandom can be to link Space Marine chapters to traitor legions, just because that would be cool. As far as I see it, it seems like Blood Raven's connection to the Thousand Sons was always intentional by the authors, but never fully committed to, and as time went on, it became less and less relevant to the writers. It is still an option, as is the case with many 40k theories in general. That's one of the setting's great strengths after all. But I really wouldn't expect any new revelations in Dawn of War 4 or any other place Blood Ravens might pop their head out in the future. Regardless of their origins, the Blood Ravens really come to life in the late 41st millennium, during various campaigns depicted in the Dawn of War series. First one being the campaign on Tartarus, during which we meet Gabriel Angelos, captain of the Blood Ravens' 3rd Company, grieving after witnessing an exterminatus of Cyrene, his home planet, which became overrun with chaos corruption. Now he is tasked with defending Tartarus from an orc invasion, but it quickly becomes apparent that orcs are being used by a more sinister enemy, the Alpha Legion. Mind you, this is all before Alpha Legion became what we know today. Back then they were just the more scheming flavor of the Chaos Space Marines. It turns out a demon prince is imprisoned on Tartarus and the Alpha Legion wants to release him as a warp storm approaches to engulf the whole planet. Shortly, chaos runs rampant on Tartarus. Even librarian Isador Akios, Gabriel's close friend, falls to its whispers and needs to be dealt with by Angelos. Not all is lost though. Angelos is aided by Inquisitor Thoth, who later gifts him with his relic demon hammer, the God Splitter. Imperials also form an uneasy alliance with the Eldar forces, which came to Tartarus to stop the great enemy. Even with such help, when Angelos finally tries to destroy the demon, he accidentally only shatters its prison, freeing it while the demon promises to hunt Blood Ravens in the future. Tartarus is ultimately lost, with the Imperials evacuating as much as they can and Angelos' honor blemished. The next time we see Blood Ravens, it is on Koronus, a Tau-controlled ex-Imperial planet, where the chapter goes in search for relics and to bring it back into the Imperial domain. In fact, aside from the chapter's affinity for Psykers, Blood Ravens became a bit infamous for their hunts and hoarding of all manners of artifacts. Many of those relics have questionable stories behind their acquisition. Items marked as gifts by the Blood Ravens but recorded as lost by their original owners, that sort of thing. Cronus, however, turns out to be a Necron tomb world, and with the arrival of the Wordbearers, Eldar and Astra Militarum, who don't really want to cooperate with the Blood Ravens, it all quickly turns into a free-for-all on a planetary scale. Space Marines ultimately conquer Koronus and win their case against the Imperial Guard, who reported them to the Inquisition. It however looks like we are going to revisit Koronus in the recently announced Dawn of War 4, the planet once more under the Necron threat. We will see what secrets it might reveal then. The next campaign of interest to us takes place in the Kaurava system, where once again Blood Ravens have to battle almost every other 40k faction which had a model line at the time. In this case, however, Space Marines bite on more than they can chew. All 5 companies deployed to this conflict are wiped out, including infamous Captain Indrik Boreal, who commanded them. With half of the chapter gone, Blood Ravens decide to regroup in Subsector Aurelia, hoping to rebuild to full strength. Located in the Ultima Segmentum, Subsector Aurelia is a main recruiting region granted to the chapter. While those increased recruitment efforts are still ongoing, the subsector steadily becomes engulfed in a growing conflict with orcs and Eldar. The defense forces are stretched thin between multiple planets, but steadily tackle the biggest threats one by one. During all this, however, the system becomes cut off from the Imperium. Astropathic silence, as if some immense presence casts a shadow in the war. Shortly, the Tyrannids arrive to devour Aurelia's planet. Even though it's only a splinter of the larger High Fleet Leviathan terrorizing the Ultima Segmentum, the resistance is almost impossible. Even with the most efficient tactics employed by the Blood Ravens, they don't have enough resources to stop the Tyrannids' progress. One by one, worlds of Aurelia are overwhelmed by the Xenos and prepared for the total consumption. The atmosphere grows thick with Tyranids, microorganisms, and capillary towers rise to deliver harvested biomass into great bioships in space. With Bloodraven's reinforcements delayed due to the shadow in the warp cast by the Tyranids' presence, all seemed lost for the chapter and millions of system's inhabitants. But the defenders commit everything to one final strike. Bloodraven's commanders devised a plan to strike deep into Tyranid-controlled territory on planet Typhon, and after acquiring samples of prime Tyranid genes, they managed to create a biotoxin to poison the whole Splinter fleet. During the incursion and subsequent administration of the toxin, much of the force is lost, including all chapter warships still remaining in the system. Dramatic moments later, though, the biotoxin appears to have indeed worked. Spread amongst the Tyranid fleet, the Xenos fall into disarray. At the same time, Bloodraven's reinforcements led by Captain Gabriel Angelos finally arrive and re-engage the Tyranids. Angelos then personally joins the remnants of the strike team on Typhon and defeats the Hive Tyrant Alpha, the main synapse creature of the whole Tyranid invasion. While the subsequent fighting was still bloody, between the biotoxin crippling the Xenos fleet and Tyranids losing their leader, the Bloodravens managed to save what was left from the subsector. Unfortunately, not so long after the Tyranid invasion, a new threat emerges in the system. Literally, because the planet Aurelia appears back from the warp, where it has been for the past 1000 years. In the early 41st millennium, a tremendous warp storm manifested in the system. Back then, planet Aurelia was its capital world, and it got hit by the warp storm particularly hard. The planet became corrupted by the greater demon of Nurgle, Ulker, who wanted the warp storm to completely consume Aurelia, stealing it whole into the warp. Bloodravens, of course, try to stop all this, led by the chapter master Moriah and epistolary Azariah Kyrus. They almost manage to destroy the demon, but Ulker kills Moriah and shatters the assault. With his last strength, epistolary Kyrus was able to imprison the greater demon on the planet. Aurelia, however, was already doomed, and now harboring the sealed greater demon and barely alive Kyrus, the planet was torn from its orbit, lost to the Immaterium. The subsector now missing the planet after which it has been named, but at least the Chaos invasion has been contained. Now, 1000 years later, this proud jewel of the sector emerged back into its old orbit as an ice wasteland, filled with traitors under the command of Aragast the Pillager and his lieutenant Eliphas. A former Dark Apostle, Bloodravens fought back during the Kaurava campaign. Bloodravens' fight isn't straightforward this time, however, with Chapter's command issuing questionable orders such as complete withdrawal from the system. Captain Gabriel Angelos is furious. He orders his third company, as well as elements of the fourth who were loyal to him, to disregard the withdrawal order and to continue the defense of the Aurelia subsector, during which they explore Space Hulk the Judgment of Charon, which appeared alongside the planet Aurelia. It turns out they were not the first Bloodravens to step on it though. Around 500 years ago, during an expedition onto this very same Space Hulk, a Bloodraven strike team got trapped on board. While searching for the way out, they found Azariah Kyrus, the same Kyrus who another 500 years before was swallowed by the warp after trapping the demon Ulker on Aurelia. Randomly finding a member of your own chapter on a hellish vessel spat out from the Immaterium is certainly suspicious, but the expedition led by Apothecary Galen had little choice in accepting its new member. Using his psychic gifts, Kyrus saved Bloodravens on multiple occasions as they searched for a way out. Without any progress, however, the Astartes start to give in to despair, with which Kyrus was no help. On the contrary, stories he told soured the mood even more, as if on purpose. But the real problems began when Apothecary Galen started hearing the voice of the great demon Ulker. It isn't clear how exactly things transpired further, but we do know the remnants of the expedition managed to return from the Space Hulk. Furthermore, in the 500 years since then, the returned epistolary Kyrus became the Blood Ravens chapter master, and Apothecary Galen, along with others from that cursed expedition, were now his honor guard. Angelos was always aware of the dubious history of his chapter master, but not to such full, possibly heretical extent. With differences in loyalty within the chapter deepening, there was still a more urgent enemy to defeat. In the meantime, Eliphaz, in a typical Chaos fashion, betrayed Lord Aragast and took over his Black Legion forces. He then went about releasing Ulker from his prison, for which the demon promised him even greater power. Angelos was quick to respond, sending a task force of his most loyal marines to stop the summoning. Eliphaz stalled for time and when defeated managed to escape, but fortunately for the Blood Ravens, Ulker wasn't yet at full strength, the summoning incomplete, leaving the greater demon still very dangerous but possible to defeat. Beaten, the Great Unclean One returned to the Immaterium in an explosion of filth and gore, thunderously laughing long after, knowing what awaited the Blood Ravens next. And what awaited them was a civil war. Not immediately though. It took 10 years to really get things going again, with chaos both literal and ideological continuing to rise in the subsector even after Ulker's defeat. The Blood Ravens fared no better. There certainly were heretical elements within the chapter, but Angelos' loyalists didn't have enough concrete evidence to openly go full force against the chapter master. The Imperial Inquisition was however aware that something was going on, and arrived in Aurelia in person of Inquisitor Adrastia of the Ordo Hereticus. There was little cooperation to be had though, since Space Marines hate other Imperial branches interfering with their business just as much as they hate orcs. Or possibly more. For the third time in a dozen years, Subsector Aurelia became engulfed in a conflict on every front. Heretic Astartes bands raided weakened Imperial domain, traitors within the Planetary Defense Forces and Astra Militarum rapidly grew in numbers. So did the orcs, thriving on growing conflict. Remnants of the Tyranid invasion still infested every planet, and Eldar continued their schemes. This was too much for Inquisitor Adrastia. Traitor or not, the Blood Ravens clearly weren't capable of managing Aurelia, and hard decisions had to be made. The Retribution fleet of the Ordo Malleus was authorized to perform exterminatus on the whole planetary system. Every planet was to be bombarded from orbit and stripped of life. Local problems deemed so costly, it was more efficient for the Imperium to start from scratch. Meanwhile, the true extent of the chapter master Kyrus' treachery was uncovered. He, as well as at least half of the Blood Ravens chapter, have completely and now openly fallen to chaos, with Kyrus planning to use all the bloodshed of the previous years and now extermination of the whole Aurelia to fuel his ascension into a demon prince. Angelos' forces were however able to locate Kyrus' ritual site and battle their way through to him. Angelos gets heavily wounded, but thanks to help of the veterans of the previous Aurelia campaigns led by Captain Apollo Diomedes, the Blood Ravens managed to banish Kyrus, ending the main threat to the system. Thanks to this swift action, the Retribution fleet is ordered to halt the rest of Aurelia's extermination, possibly saving billions from unnecessary demise. Gabriel Angelos gets treated by chapter's apothecaries, his broken body reconstructed with extensive bionics. For his unyielding resolve in saving the chapter from Kyrus' corruption, Angelos is chosen as the new chapter master, possibly the first in thousands of years who is not psychically gifted. There is a lot of work to be done, most importantly purging the remaining heretics from the chapter and ensuring Aurelia's stability. Not to mention Bloodraven's dwindled numbers, once more in need of rebuilding and restructuring. The scars of Aurelia campaigns and Kairos' treason will probably haunt the Bloodravens for many years, possibly changing chapter's philosophy just as much as success of Vidya shaped them in previous millennia. Before Bloodravens had much time to lick their wounds, however, another calamity struck them, this time one of galactic proportions. With the opening of the Great Rift, Bloodraven's domain, same as most of the galaxy, was consumed by tides of the warp. Hordes of demons manifested everywhere, with cries for help answered by Angelos and his chapter. The battles were bloody and chaotic, but when the worst of the storms subsided, Aurelia was visited by the Torchbearer fleet led by Shield Captain Pertinax. They brought with them technology and resources to create Primaris Space Marines, an improved template for Astartes creation. Ordered and approved by Primarch Reboot Gilliman, they also brought with them news that the Primarch has returned and is now in charge of the Imperium, since Bloodravens had little idea of what was happening in the galaxy since the fall of Cadia. With his chapter devastated time after another, Angelos was quick to appreciate the replenishment the Primaris forces offered. They also took this opportunity to study for possible informations related to their Genseed origins, but outcomes of it are yet unknown to us. Since then, Bloodravens have rebuilt, and with advancements to Rubicon Primaris, possibly are now a fully Primaris chapter. In the trailer of Dawn of War 4, we see Cyrus, one of the heroes of Aurelia's campaigns, now ascended to Primaris status, so it is very likely that other members, including Angelos, did the same. And that's it for now. When I started working on this video, possibility of Dawn of War 4 continuing the Bloodravens saga seemed highly unlikely, if not impossible, with the chapter slowly fading into obscurity. But against all odds, both in universe and in real life, Bloodravens continue their relevance through yet another age in Warhammer history. Thank you for watching.